Okay, I guess it is happening now. So again, nice to see everyone from all corners of the globe. It's really a very exciting moment for all of us. And we decided to celebrate it by inviting some dear friends and talented colleagues today. And I'm grateful to Nick Terpstra, Rosa Smurra, and of course, Sharon DeWitte for joining us today. But I'd like to start really by thanking those truly sine quibus non, and above all, Taylor Zaneri, who has not only put together this workshop, but is almost single-handedly responsible for the map app she will present today. That said, she was generously and kindly been supported by the folks at CREATE at the University of Amsterdam, the Università degli Studi di Bologna, and the Centro Gina Fasoli per la Storia della Città, the Soprintendenza Archeologia, Beni Culturali e Paesaggio per la Città Metropolitana di Bologna, and last but not least, our favorite archive, the Archivio di Stato di Bologna. As all of you have really made this special day possible for the Healthscaping project, all of whose members are here today. And as some of you know, it's been delayed by nearly a year because of COVID, a really unfortunate situation, which has ironically made today's event and the project as a whole unexpectedly relevant. But we hope that the project and the map app stays relevant, or at least intellectually stimulating for many other reasons in the years to come. As you may also know, the development of GPS and GIS technologies starting in the 1970s is at the root of the so-called spatial turn in the social sciences and the humanities. But in a sense, it was the medical sciences, and in particular public health, that pioneered the use of mapping for promoting health. Newspapers and websites over the past 15 months have been replete with fancy animated health maps, and we all rely on, in many ways, on these maps to keep abreast of developing situations and even plan our movements almost anywhere around the world. And some trace this connection between health and spatiality and mobility to John Snow and his famous map of London, which helped him pinpoint, as it were, the epicenter of a cholera outbreak in 1854. Even more famous than his map, however, is the water pump on Broad Street, London, which is still today preserved in commemoration of a landmark event in the history of public health. Or should I say, among friends, in the short-sighted narrative of modern biomedical public health, which was then at its infancy. For in truth, as a lieu de mémoire, the Broad Street pump doesn't send us hurtling into modernity, but rather reminds us of a deeper understanding of urban topography, mobility, and above all, infrastructure as a widely recognized key to urban health. The map app we're launching today, and the scholarship I hope it will continue to stimulate for years to come, reflects a nuanced and a dynamic understanding of urban infrastructure as a paramount concern when it came to people's well-being at the time. No, it wasn't based on germ theory, nor did cities have an army of trained medical practitioners or health administrators. Instead, cities relied on a multitude of eyes scanning the streets pro maiori sanitate hominum, for people's greater health. But as the saying goes, in Bologna, the buck stopped with our beloved fungal officials, infrastructure specialists who have left rich records behind, which detail how deeply the city cared for its environment, precisely at an era which most people think about as hygienically backwards. Now, I say the Fango are our favorite urban officials, but they are, of course, they were, of course, not everyone's favorite officials, given how annoying they must have been to butchers, millers, dyers, tanners, and grocers throughout the city. And we can only guess what oxen, cows, and pigs made of them. But we like them nonetheless, since they have left us what must be the richest set of sources for environmental protection for all of Italy in this period, and as such, very probably for most of Europe, right here, or for some of you, right there in Bologna. Not that any of that was enough for Taylor Zaneri, of course. She has added a stupendous amount of spatial and material data to contextualize the Fango records, as you'll see in a minute, providing a first map of its kind and an application to begin tracing correlations and testing different hypotheses. The archaeological and historical sources in this case are especially plentiful for Bologna. But while Taylor and I and many others with us here today are always grateful to be able to work in the Red City, I would be remiss if I didn't stress in no uncertain terms that what has been so richly preserved for Bologna is in basic ways typical for numerous towns and cities across and beyond the peninsula. Indeed, in 2 weeks' time, the Northern European members of our Healthscaping team will present a similarly rich but very different admixture of sources and archaeological data for the city of Ghent, around which we built our second health map application, and which I encourage you to get to know as well. But first things first, and I'd like to hand it over to the real hero of today's workshop, Taylor Zaneri, who will take us into the future of Bologna's past. And I will chair this first session. So if there are any questions, we will have some minutes for those at the end, and I will try to organize that as well. But I'm going to hand it over to Taylor, and good luck to you all.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with everyone, and let's see. All right, so everybody should be able to see my presentation, right? Okay, I'm going to take the nodding as a yes. Okay, so thank you everyone again for coming, and hopefully this will be one of the last Zoom conferences that we all do. All right, so today, so I'm going to talk about mapping public health measures in late medieval Bologna, and specifically looking at the statutes, which are quite a rich, interesting, and very spatial source. So moving right along. So as Guy sort of said in the introduction, urban public health is a process. It's an activity, it's an action, it's contingent on many different things. So if we think about cities, we're going to take into account, for example, existing infrastructure, the physical environment, the population that's living within that city, the activities that are occurring in particular areas, and of course the actions that are being taken to mitigate health hazards and promote sanitation. So what this means in practice is that urban public health varies over space, as it does today. It varies over time, and it varies across seasonality. For example, different times of the year present different kinds of health risks and issues. And so this, to maintain urban public health, it's a process. It requires conscientious thought and action, and very often mitigating actions. So it's not something that just happens by accident. And so that's something that this project really wants to stress. So now turning our attention to Italy. So we know through numerous documentary sources, as well as archaeological sources, that northern Italian cities experienced population growth in the 13th century. And we can often tell this just by the fact that cities expand their town walls during this period. So they have to construct new town walls because their population is growing. And this is a big investment in labor, in money, in time. And it's something that takes decades to finish. So we see this across Northern Italian cities, the construction of new walls during this period. And we also see during this period city statutes from cities such as Milan, from Verona, from Ferrara, from Florence, and of course Bologna, which contain dozens, if not hundreds, of rubrics which aim to manage the environment and to promote healthy and safe cities. And these statutes include very detailed measures about regulations on the environment, on the construction of buildings, the management of waste, the construction of sewers and drains, the control of artisanal activities, especially those working with animal products or fire, and of course the maintenance of clean drinking water. And there's been quite a lot of excellent research done on this, both historically as well as archaeologically. In particular, Laura Sabinese, an archaeologist, has written a really great book about the management of waste from the archaeological perspective in Northern Italian cities, including Bologna. And we see that this was a very complex and intricate process. What we also see is in these cities, in addition to having these health regulations, they also create offices to oversee the implementation and the management of these regulations, as in Bologna, and Guy has done a lot of work on this, and in many other cities across Italy. And this happens well before the Black Death, decades before. So it's clear that health and safety is a concern well before the Black Death, and it's of course part of creating a city that's not only safe and healthy, but also a city that is morally and aesthetically pleasing. And it's also an apparatus of control as well, as it is today. So turning our attention to the statutes of Bologna, so I looked at the statutes from 1245 to 1267. So they contain over 100 health and sort of infrastructure regulations with specific locations that they prescribe actions to. And there are many more than this, but I only chose the ones that were very spatially specific. And often locations are mentioned more than once. And so in Bologna, as Guy said, there's an office for enforcing these regulations, the Fango officials, and they recorded any violations to these regulations in registers, and they created dozens of registers with really rich spatial information about what had occurred, where the offender, and the type of violation. And so Guy collected all of these records, of which there are over 3,000, and we analyzed them in a previous article. And again, most of them are prior to 1348. But what I'm going to talk about today is these specific statute regulations themselves, the ones that the Fango officials were enforcing, because they kind of give us a different picture of the city, and we can also then compare sort of the regulations to the practice and their enforcement. So that gives us an additional layer of detail. So the city officials in Bologna were very concerned, again, with maintaining a city that was sanitary and safe. And these statute regulations contain very specific information regarding these health and infrastructure measures. So they tell us, for example, very specifically where these regulations and these prescriptions were, when they should occur, why, what materials they should be used, or the kind of infrastructure that was being regulated. And more importantly, they're formulated with a very holistic and complex understanding of the urban environment, meaning that these regulations are also spatially very specific, but they also fit into a broader picture of what urban health should look like. So if you're constructing a sewer or a drain, for example, that's going to link up with your canal system, which is eventually going to remove waste from the city, it needs to be able to function. It needs to hydraulically be able to work. It needs to be the right dimensions. It needs to be the right depth. It needs to be the right elevation, the proper slope. So this is something that is a very complex process. And so we also see, if you look at the statutes, very different hygienic and sanitary regulations for different parts of the city. And so, as well as seeing sort of critical nodes or areas that had to be maintained in order for the city to function. And one of which I'm going to talk about in a few slides is the canal system. And there are specific areas within the canal system that had to remain unimpeded, unblocked, for the water to flow into the canal system, into the city. And if these were impeded or blocked, then the entire system would not function. And you can see the importance of certain areas within the statutes by simply mapping these regulations. So before we turn to the regulations themselves, just a brief overview of the city of Bologna. So water arrives in Bologna from the mountains located at the south of the city and flows into a system of canals, sewers, drains, ditches. And so the water is flowing from the south to the north, and broadly speaking from the center sort of towards the periphery. And these canals had both productive and hygienic functions. So these two functions had to be balanced within this system. And the city developed as a series of sort of concentric walls with a canal or ditch surrounding each set of walls. So as you can see, there's sort of, as in many Italian cities, there's a Roman core, then sort of the first set of medieval walls, and then a second set of medieval walls, which you can see on the map. Key locations included markets in the center of the city in Piazza Maggiore and Porta Revignate. And then I've also included on this map just some of the important monasteries within the city. To kind of locate us. All right, so another thing, as I mentioned before, water flows from the south to the north and from the center to the periphery. And so I've just included the canals and then also surface water flow. So how was water going to be flowing on the ground? And again, you can see that I've circled in black on the right side of the screen that there's a bunch of sort of water that's going to be flowing and kind of collecting in that part of the city that doesn't necessarily link up with any of the major canal systems very well. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. This water flow is based on modern elevation levels, but it's a pretty good proxy for surface water flow in the medieval period. And we can talk about that a little bit more later as well. So this is just showing you the population distribution, and this is based on the 1296 estimate and the information from the Centro Gina Fazzoli. And you can see just the distribution of population. And by the end of the 13th century, you have upwards of 55 to 65,000 inhabitants in Bologna. So this again is just mapped by church parish, just to give you an idea of where people are living. And then lastly, just showing you the distribution of artisans. And this is based on a study by Antonio Ivanpini. And this is again mapped by church parish. And I've just pulled out some of the artisans that work with animal products because these artisans and their activities were highly regulated in the statutes. So I'm showing you butchers, people who work with wool, drapers, leather workers, people whose activities require water and produce significant amounts of waste that is then going to need to be removed. So turning our attention now to the regulations themselves, as I said before, they contain very specific spatial information about the construction of infrastructure and also the management of waste. And so they give us very specific location information, that is the sections of streets or the area between houses where these regulations were occurring. So the construction of infrastructure, or for example, the management of waste. They tell us the materials that were being used, the dimensions of this infrastructure, for example, of sewers or drains, how the infrastructure connects to the entire system, and also where matter that this infrastructure is going to remove, for example, water or waste or dirt, where it's going to start and where it's eventually going to end up. So again, this is these regulations are formulated with a very specific spatial consciousness and understanding of the matter that is present in different parts of the city, and also how it's going to move and how it's going to be removed. And so, as I said, I have been able to identify 140 location-specific sanitary and infrastructure measures, and that a little over 100 of them I'm able to map very specifically in GIS, and another about 10, 15 I'm able to map sort of on the level of the neighborhood, meaning I don't know the exact street where these were prescribed to, but I can tell you essentially the neighborhood or the district. And so then using these statutes, we can look at what areas of the city were most heavily regulated, what these regulations were, and what were the differences across the city. How am I doing this? Well, as I said before, the statute rubrics are very specific, and they often refer to the houses or towers of important families to specify the locations. They also sometimes refer to street names themselves, or include the location of a major church or monastery. And since these have been very well studied in Bologna, the towers, the churches, the important families, it's possible to identify these areas that the regulations are describing, and then we can map these in GIS. And so, for example, I'm just giving you, this is just one of the many regulations, and it's telling us exactly where there's an issue with filth and with water that's kind of lingering in this area. And so we know where this church is, and we also know where this tower is of this particular family. And so then I'm able to map that area and put this regulation in GIS. So, for example, the locations that this statute is describing, I've just included a Google Maps sort of screenshot for you. So we have the church that's being described in the statutes, and then we have the tower. And so that we know that that specific area is what these statutes are referring to, and then I can map that in GIS. And so I was able to do this for a little over 100 of those 140 location-specific regulations. And so this is just a summary of the type of regulations that you see in the statutes and the health promoting prescriptions. So as you can see, there's several different types of strategies that we see in the statutes in order for promoting a healthy and safe city. And again, I pulled out the ones that are location specific. There's many more regulations generally for artisans and for waste, but these are the ones that mention a very specific location. So the most common was a prohibition on waste disposal. So that is prohibiting the disposing of waste in particular areas or zones. This was followed by the construction and maintenance of the canal system, which included canals, sewers, ditches, and drains. This is followed by paving and maintaining roads, which was meant to promote water flow and to remove waste from the streets. And then we also see things like water regulation, the zoning of artisans, particularly activities involving burning or involving animal products, and then also the construction of walls and porticos, again, to sort of block off certain areas or to promote the flow of water and the removal of waste. So, this is a table just showing you, again, as I said before, the statutes are very specific, not only in the kinds of prescriptions that they're talking about, but also the material that they're trying to deal with. So they specify if it's filth, if it's water, if it's animal products, if it's dung, if it's trash, if it's sewage. So again, they're very specific, which and very spatial, which shows that a sort of consciousness of the city. So the people that are writing these understand that different material and different problems occur in different parts of the city and are developing regulations specifically to deal with these location-specific issues. This next map is showing you the zones that are most highly regulated within the city. And so I've included 5 zones which have which have the most regulations. And so I'm just briefly going to run through these areas and kind of talk about their broader significance. So the two most zones which have the most regulations are the center of the city, which is Piazza Maggiore, which has the major market and also all of the government buildings of the city. It's the center of the city. And the second most regulated area is area number 2 to the south. And so as you can see on the map, I've included the sort of the major canal water courses, that this area is in between essentially the major water courses of the city. So includes the major water courses as they're entering into the city. So what, as I said before, water is entering from the south. So if you have any sort of blockage in the southern part of the system, it's going to impede and restrict water flow going north. And it's essentially going to mess up flow for the entire system. So this area was really important that this area and the water flow here be maintained. A third area, as you can see with number 3, is sort of that area that I mentioned before, which is significant for 2 reasons. One, it was because it contains a lot of artisans, particularly those working with animal products, and artisans which produce a lot of waste. And it's also an area, if you remember from the map of water flow, where a lot of surface water seems to be collecting. And indeed, looking at the statutes from the regulations, it's clear that this area had issues with drainage. And then areas 4 and 5, area 4 is again located on one of the major canal water courses, and it was the area adjacent to San Francesco, which was an important monastery. And then area number 5 was the cathedral. So these are the most sort of regulated zones within the city. And again, I think that there's a very clear logic behind the regulations in these areas. So then if we turn to the actual regulations themselves, what I've done is I've traced the area that each regulation, the spatial limits of each regulation, and I've color coded them based on the type of regulation they are. So I've included any kind of road regulations, waste disposal prohibitions, the construction of and maintenance of the water infrastructure, water regulations, and then artisanal zoning. And as you can see, most of them are in the southern part of the city. And then there's different kinds of regulations for different parts of the city. For example, there's a lot of waste disposal regulations, not only in the center of the city, but also in the south where the major water courses are. There is a lot of road regulations and also sewer and canal maintenance regulations in the eastern part and more towards the north of the city. And then we also see water regulations along the major canal courses. So again, there's different strategies for the promotion and maintenance of health in different locations, and that's something that we should expect. All right. So when we, just to kind of sum up the regulations, if we look at them in total, in GIS, over 40% of them are in the southern part of the city. And again, the majority of them are between the major southern water courses as they're entering the city. And this was a critical point, because if these water courses were blocked, it's going to disrupt the entire canal system, which has productive as well as waste removing functions. So this would be a serious impediment to the functioning of the city. There is also a concentration of regulations to the north and the east, which is probably due to the concentration of artisans that lived in this area, which produced a lot of waste, and also to the environmental factors that surface water was going to be collecting in this area just based on the topography of the city, and this needed to be drained. So overall, the regulations that we see in the statutes are created with a very specific knowledge of the city and also a very specific spatial knowledge and understanding of movement, how different material is going to be moving through the city, through the streets, the canals, the drains, if it's liquid, if it's solid, if it's waste, if it's water. So again, this is something that requires a lot of thought, and it's not something that happens simply by accident. And I think just the sheer number of rubrics and regulations in the statutes really point to this well-developed spatial understanding of the city and of its infrastructure. Just to kind of sum up this particular, just looking at these statutes, they were created with an understanding of the city, of its population, of its environment, and of course of the existing infrastructure. And there were different kinds of regulations that were enacted in different parts of the city. Some areas were much more highly regulated than others, and that waste management and the promotion of hygiene and safety was part of creating spaces that were also aesthetically and morally pleasing. And this was a priority based on the number of regulations and also based on the fact that you have an office and officials specifically created to oversee and to enforce these regulations. Regulatory efforts like this, as I said in the beginning, the management of waste, the regulations on the construction of infrastructure, the maintenance of clean water, these appear in many statutes in northern and central Italy well before the Black Death. So this is clearly something when statutes are being written that is an important part of creating a functioning city and a functioning government. And of course, regulation is an apparatus for governmental control, and I'm not discounting that part of it. And I'm not suggesting that there weren't health risks either. It's clear that people had to deal with many different types of health risks, many different kinds of waste, animal, human, domestic, industrial, standing water. But I mean, these are present, I would say, in most cities. If you live in a city, you can probably find most of these. So it's not that these risks weren't present, but there was clearly a well-developed administrative apparatus to kind of confront and to deal with these challenges. That medieval people, while clearly operating within a different health framework, understood the consequences of these risks and tried to promote hygiene within their cities. And so what we've been able to do is to put these statutes along with other information relating to demography, relating to enforcement of these regulations, the data from the Fango, into a WebGIS so we can more clearly understand the spatial consequences of health and the differences across the city. And so that's what the purpose of this map is. And so it's finally live, and I've included the website there. So if you want to go check it out, we would be very excited to hear your feedback. And so this is just a bibliography, and thank you. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions or comments.
Thank
Taylor,
you,
I have oh, sorry. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So I'm not sure if you have information on this, but I was wondering, in terms of the regulations, if you have a sense of to what extent they were reactionary versus proactive?
That's a good question. My sense is, well, at least some of them are reactionary because they're describing specific health problems that exist. And so these regulations are being implemented to deal with a certain health problem. Like, for example, the example that I showed, that there's this filth and water that's lingering in this area. So the area needs to be paved, and this is going to facilitate the removal of this waste. So at least some of them, I would say, are reactionary. And some of them also are proactive because some of them also call for sort of general maintenance of the system, that every year or every couple of months, the system needs to be cleaned or needs to be flushed out. So it seems that people are understanding that this will become a problem if certain actions aren't taken.
Thank you. And I should have started by saying your talk was very interesting. I'm really excited to start exploring the WebGIS. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sharon. We have maybe time for one last question from Claire.
Very quickly, yes, thanks Taylor for a beautiful presentation. Just to add to Sharon's question, do you ever see in the regulations that they say that the regulation is no longer in working, that it's sort of come to an end?
No, but not in the statutes, although if you look in the later statutes, there are there's another well-published set of statutes from 1288. So sometimes certain regulations will not be there anymore. So yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Anne, I saw your hand sort of half up before. Did you want to ask a quick
question? I do want
to.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a wonderful paper. It seems that Bologna does not have a major city that runs through it. So this management of water, how much was it the very basic parameters of it, where drainage would be, that sort of thing, established by the Romans?
Oh, that's a really great question. So fortunately, there's a lot of really great archaeology in Bologna, and so at least the prevailing archaeological thought is that the Roman system goes out of use in the late Roman period, so that they really needed to kind of construct a lot of new infrastructure. And this was based on the fact that you see kind of fill in the infrastructure containing Roman, late Roman, essentially remains and ceramics. So yeah, the idea is that the Roman infrastructure kind of went out of use.
I see that there are more questions, but I want us to stick to our very strict timetable. So if you could, John, if you could hold on to your question, and we'll have more time later to discuss things, but as it happens, so sorry for that, but I'm going to hand it actually to Taylor, who is going to chair the next session, introduce Rosa, and move forward. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so now I'm really happy and excited to introduce Professor Rosa Smurra from the University of Bologna, and she's a historian and has published widely on Bologna regarding demography, especially on the estimi, on citizenship, on the construction and the physical layout of the city, particularly related to 3D reconstructions and GIS. And she's also responsible for the Centro Gina Fazzoli. And so she's going to be talking to us today about the fiscal sources and pollution.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Taylor. Let me first congratulate you for this achievement. It's a great achievement. I know you worked hard, but there is a very great result. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you for having me today. Thank you very much. I'm trying to show my screen now, if possible, for a short presentation. Pollution issues in late medieval Bologna from especially the fiscal sources point of view. Demographic and economic growth gave rise to problems of waste disposal and pollution in medieval towns and cities. As a result, city governments sought a compromise, as we have seen, between economic development and environmental needs. The pinpointing of polluting activities went hand in hand with the identification of areas, streams, canals, specifically dedicated to certain types of production, while other areas were dedicated to the disposal of pollution and waste, as we have seen. In particular, the protection of urban water supply resulted in the need to relocate polluting activities to certain areas. Specific regulation applied to freshwater supplies, such as provision of a buffer zone of varying width around the drinking wells, depending on the type of activity. So, what were the main activities identified as sources of pollution in medieval Bologna. The list of such activities was a long one. Chalk furnaces, tanneries, dye works, parchment manufacture, flax rating, metal and paint forges, candle production with the processing of animal fat, tendon processing to produce strings for musical instruments, and bone processing. This paper will focus on parchment makers, the artisans that were clearly in high demand in a university city, and how they were concentrated in a compact neighborhood in a specific area of the city. In the Middle Ages, Bologna was famous all over Europe for its studium, as the present-day university was known at the time. The great master of the studium, such as Curcio and his son Francesco, were greatly revered by their contemporaries, as shown by monuments still present in the urban landscape, the tomb of Gladiator near San Francesco. The international reputation of the university attracted many students to Bologna. So the student population was numerous, especially with regard to students of civil and canon law. It has been estimated that between 1265 and 1269, and in the year 1286, more than 2,000 students were present in the city, and more than half of them were international students. As we see in the miniature, when attending lectures, students were required to bring their own textbooks. So the production of textbooks was a complex and a profitable business associated with the important role of the studium of the university in the city. And the production of textbooks on law was an especially important business. Thousands of manuscripts for law curriculum were made available to students in a mass market for books. As the making of a manuscript is by necessity labor-intensive, there were many skilled professionals working in the production of university textbooks. The division of labor among the artisans shows a significant level of specialization into 4 major occupations, representing the main activities in manuscript production: parchment manufacturers, writing, illuminating, and book binding. There is a great deal to be discovered about these groups in Bologna. The parchment makers' business involved a long sequence of operations, culminating in the creation of sheaves of pages, quaterni. Parchment is the result of a complex treatment of animal skin, also because the skin is made up of several layers, and the one used for parchment is the innermost layer. Once they were removed from the animals, skins were preserved in salt. Without salt treatment, most animal skins would have lasted only 2 or 3 days before deteriorating to the point of becoming unusable. So the next stage was soaking the skin in a solution of slaked lime, calcium carbonate, for 8 or to 10 days. What remained of flesh, hair, and epidermis was removed manually with a scraper. The skin was also soaked in a vat of lime for cleansing, calcination. Later, the skin was stretched over a wooden frame, stretching frame, where further depilation was carried out with a sharp knife, followed by a second washing by repeated ablutions with the water fixed on the frame, the parchment was left to dry in a well-ventilated area. So the surface was then smoothed with a pumice stone to make it more homogeneous and smooth. So this was a very laborious and skillful process, and it was perceived by contemporaries as a source of a pollution. It is well known that the protection of public hygiene, water quality, and air quality is a concern that emerges in the agenda of a Bologna political elite throughout the 13th and the 14th centuries, as Taylor said. The mid-30th century city statutes required artisans who processed animal skins to comply with the precise rules, well aware that the water resulting from such processing was highly polluting. All subsequent enactments of the city statutes dealt with this matter. In particular, the 1253 statutes regulated the disposal of highly polluting water produced by the processing of skins, the tanning, dyeing, and liming process, the latter specifically to obtain parchment, not paper, parchment. The water from the calcination of skins could not be disposed of in the city street within the circla, the third ring walls, under penalty of a fine of 40 soldi. Exemptions from this regulation were granted for those who had their business near the Aposa stream, into which they could discharge the water with calcination residues. There is no indication of which hides were processed or by which craftsmen, but the statutes give an important indication that the hides were disposed in the Aposa and not in other canals in the city, showing that workshops had already been set up along the Aposa, although it is not stated at which point, nor is indicated which artisans were involved. Obviously, this included the parchment makers. Subsequent statutes did not modify the general principles, except for the gradual increase in penalties. The statutes of 1288, including the provision on public health, the possibility of disposing of a processing of residues in the Savena Canal, but only at night when the water was released onto the street for periodic washing. The 1335 statutes reiterate the previous regulations, but introduced a measure that was politically motivated rather than for public health purpose, since it granted the right to members of the guilds, including parchment makers, to carry on their trade in the usual places, in the usual manner, despite the prohibition laid down in the city statutes. These are the facility that the Comune di Popolo, the popular regime, reserved for members of the guilds. It is well known that membership of a guild was a prerequisite for holding public office in Bologna. The 1356 statutes regulating parchment makers reiterated the public health measures laid down in the previous city statutes. They specified that it was forbidden to skin domestic animals and other dead animals outside the place of residence, in the street or in the moats between the gate of Strada Maggiore and that of Castiglione on the Torresotti walls. They then described the process of liming, forbidding action contrary to the sequence of stages laid down in the regulations. So parchment makers were dependent on the availability of the water, but what were the areas suitable for parchment production? The area that proved to be the most suitable for parchment production was the brina of Santo Stefano. In the last quarter of the 11th century, this area, situated in the eastern sector and owned by the monastery of Santo Stefano, consisted of an extensive area of enclosed land used as vegetable gardens and vineyards, and crisscrossed by important highways, Strada Maggiore and Strada Santo Stefano, that converged from the outlying districts on what is now Piazza di Porta Ravegnano. In the following century, economic development and growth led to a significant demand for building plots in this area, the area in yellow on the map, mainly by people moving in from the countryside. In this connection, a second concentric ring of walls, the Torresotti walls, was built to protect a more extensive area. The monastery met this demand for housing. In the area leading off from the streets, the monastery carved out a strip of land 24 or 36 feet deep. This was subdivided into plots, of which the monastery retained the freehold, while granting them to leaseholders. A surviving large number of leasehold agreements, stipulated up to the year 1738, is relating to urban plots of which the monastery was the freeholder. Significant evidence of how the urban layout of the brina of the Santo Stefano developed over time is provided by a rubric of the 1253 statutes. It concerns the contrada of San Petronio, recently created within this sector in the brina, which had no access to a public road and consequently could not connect with the rest of the city streets. So it was decided to build a street from the Contrada of San Petronio to the Burgo of Strada Maggiore, measuring 12 feet in width, starting from that Burgo and continuing in a straight line to the Contrada of San Petronio. It was also decided to build a small stone bridge over the Savena. The Contrada was laid out within the monastery grounds where there were other settlements. This statutory provision created a new road leading to the Savena Canal, thus making provision for a new parchment making area. It later took the name Cartoleria Nuova, the present day Via Guerrazzi, to distinguish it from the street of the same name within the Torresotti walls in the parish of San Biagio, to which the adjective Vecchia was added. So as we have seen, the Savena Canal played a crucial role in the infrastructure of the area, not only for defensive purposes immediately outside the Torresotti walls, but also for supporting an industrial district that needed large supplies of clean water. The canal, which had been built as a branch of the river Savena, as Taylor said, reached the city along the present-day Via Toscana from the south and the Via Murri, branching off near the church of Santa Maria della Misericordia, outside Porta Castiglione. One branch proceeded into the city along Via Castiglione, and then joined the Aposa just before Porta Ravegnana, while a second branched off the Trivio degli Oselletti, a crossroad between Via Castiglione and the present-day Via Orfeo. Then continued into Via Rialto, where due to the steep slope, the canal was called Fiacca al Collo and fed the eastern moat defending the Torre Zotti walls. These waters of the eastern moat between Porta Santo Stefano and Porta di Strada Maggiore, uncontaminated by sewage discharges and the waste water from economic activities, were used for specific economic activities, in particular, the production of parchment. After being used for such processing, the canal reached the northern section of the Aposa. A further branch at the level of the Due Torri ran along Via San Donato, the present-day Via Zamboni. So these transformations were the result of a subsequent adaptation to emerging needs. Example, we have a group of parchment makers also in the parish of the Church of Santa Maria Maddalena along Via Zamboni. So parchment makers were key figures in the book industry, as the carta membranis, the Latin term for parchment, was the main raw material used in the production of books. Unlike scribes, stationers, and illuminators, parchment makers were obliged to join the guild. So the membership list of the parchment makers, the Matricula Cartolariorum, in the year 1294, recorded 153 names. Unfortunately, this source does not reveal where the parchment makers lived. However, the information can be profitable supplemented with other sources, such as the tax census from the late 1270s, where the taxpayers were listed by residence. To be precise, this fiscal source, dating from 15 years prior of the Matricula Cartolariorum, unlike the individual tax declarations, does not show individual properties and incomes of the heads of household, but only their tax rate, enabling us to estimate their wealth and assets. Moreover, this source indicates that most of the parchment makers lived in the parish of San Tommaso di Strada Maggiore, with a small number in the nearby parish of San Biagio. They are very close, the two parishes. So this was an area close to the 12th century walls, the Torre Zotti walls, with an abundance of water, as we have seen. In this area, the city moat was fed by the canal, the Savana Canal, and as a result, the water was particularly clean and suitable for the process of parchment making. Later sources, and we put online these sources at about 15 years ago, later fiscal sources show a similar demographic profile. The 1296 tax declaration, estimo, as we call it, of Guido Bencevenni, is a case in point. Unlike the majority of the 1296 taxpayers who claimed to have filed their previous tax returns at the time of Pax de Pacibus in the late 1270s, Guido, who was from Gargognano, from near Faenza, stated that he had filed his tax returns at the time of the Podesta Matteo de' Maggi. This allows us to infer that it happened in 1285. He had probably moved to Bologna at about that time. In 1294, however, Guido was enrolled on the Matricula Cartolariorum. The preserved part of his estimo, unfortunately only a fragment as we can see, contains important information, such as his residence in the parish of San Biagio, where he owned 2 houses. The first stood on the land of Santo Stefano under a leasehold agreement. The house had among its neighbors 2 parchment makers, Bonfantino Gerardi, who in fact was enrolled in the contemporary Matricula Cartolariorum, and Duzzolo, not yet enrolled in. Guido's second house stood on the land of the Comune of Bologna under a leasehold agreement. In particular, he specified that he stood in Fossato. That means along the moat flanking the Torresotti walls, at the time largely dismantled since a more extensive ring of the city walls was now in place. Quite a similar situation is that of Ioanninos Alberti Oneste, enrolled in the 1294 Matricula Cartolariorum. His residence was in the parish church of San Biagio, where he owned 1 house laying on the land on the Comune of Bologna. In particular, Ioannino specified that he stood in Fossato. His neighbors were Thomas Bertolotti and Bonandrea Bonioannis, 2 parchment makers, unsurprisingly. So there are obviously also famous, very famous parchment makers in Bologna, and one of the most famous Bologna's parchment making families was the Villola family, present in sources from the second half of the 13th century onwards. There is evidence of Petrizzolo, or Petrus, grandfather of the celebrated chronicler Pietro da Villola. Petrizzolo de Villola was a parchment maker. He lived in the parish of San Tommaso of Strada Maggiore, and his taxable rate was £50. Other information on these parchment makers can be gathered from the fiscal declaration of his properties carried out for tax purposes in 1296. From this declaration, we learn that Dominus Petrus Cartolarius, quondam Ioannis de Villola, was still a resident of the parish of San Tommaso di Strada Maggiore, where, as we have seen, parchment makers were concentrated during the 13th century. Petrus declared that he possessed a small piece of wooded and arable land in the hilly zone to the south of Bologna. Also, as he stated, he had borrowed money, £20, to be invested in his business as a parchment maker in arte cartoleria. The fiscal declaration concludes with the inspection carried out by the officials of the commune, who verified the final tax rate as £36. And this figure indicates for the moment a modest fortune, but also that shows that Petrus de Villola was active in the book production trade. Also, Pax and Lambertinus, the son of Petrus, were parchment makers, as shown by the Matricula Cartolariorum in 1294. The chronicler Pietro, son of Lambertino, generated Floriano, who carried on his father's work, both as a chronicler and as a parchment maker. Pietro and Floriano da Villola were the authors of the most ancient Cronaca of Bologna, which opens with this miniature illustrating the work and the tools of the trade of the parchment makers and their workshop. So we see the stretching frame, the sharp knife, the sheaves of pages on the shelves, and the pumice stone for smoothing. To conclude, fiscal sources not only make it possible to identify parchment makers who were not yet recorded in the guild list, but more importantly, they also enable us to identify the social composition of city neighborhoods, which is crucial for reconstruction of population pressure in a certain district and pollution, of course. Working in a GIS environment provides insights into the interaction between the urban structure, public health, and the activities of the inhabitants. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rosa. That was really interesting and just gave me all sorts of ideas.
So I'm sure that we can collaborate a little more in the future. And now the pandemic, of course, made things very difficult for several reasons. But we hope that we can continue to collaborate, and I'm sure that there is a lot to do, also because you set up a very wonderful tool for scholars, and I'm sure that this will attract more researches. And yes, you know where you can contact me.
Yes. Okay, so does anybody want to, well, do we have a little time for one or two questions, and then maybe we'll save the rest for the end? I have a question. I actually, so it sounds like you see a lot of other artisans then in these fiscal sources, then not just the parchment makers. I was just curious if you were just say some of the other artisans that you can kind of identify with this.
Yes, there are tanners, and also a few butchers, a few, not many, and some notaries. Notaries are everywhere, as you know. Notaries are very well distributed across the city. Well, there is a very high concentration between these two parishes, San Biagio and San Tommaso Maggiore. Probably at the beginning, first in San Tommaso Maggiore, then in San Biagio. I'm trying to understand what kind of moving they did in a few decades, because the panorama is slightly different from the middle of the 13th century in comparison with the end of the century. So there is something different a little bit, but definitely there was a high concentration of parchment makers because of the water, of course, and they were invited to reside in that area. Within, outside the Torrisotti walls, because the first group was inside. The second group more outside the secondary walls.
Interesting.
Since as probably you know, the estimate, when taxpayers were declaring the properties, they try to describe the property. My house stands on this place, my neighbors are blah blah blah. So this is a very good source to understand the demographic profile. Because the guild list, the membership list, yes, of course, it's fantastic, but it's not enough. Also because not all artisans were capable to pay fees to be enrolled. So it's more likely you find them as neighbors in a fiscal declaration of another taxpayer.
Yeah.
So this is what I like. So you know, I am very keen on the capacity of the fiscal sources, because there is a lot to be investigated.
Sure.
More and more and more and more and more. I try to do.
Yeah.
But there is a lot to do more. Yeah. And especially for this late 13th century estimate, because they are not complete, because they are not complete. Better to specify that they are not complete. This is a not complete snapshot of the population in Bologna, but it's quite close to the real composition. The century later, after the end of the 14th century, the estimate of the end of the 14th century, they are not in this situation, because we have just half of the city described, not the whole. So this as a caveat for people studying estimate, because better to understand this difference between the late 13th century estimate and the late 14th century estimate. Okay.
I think that on this important distinction, maybe we should move to our next speaker.
Oh yeah. No, we will, and we have more time at the end to go over
exactly
for more questions. So, okay, so now we're going to turn to Professor Sharon DeWitte, who is an anthropologist and a bioarchaeologist from the University of South Carolina, and she has expertise in paleodemography and paleoepidemiology, and has examined how factors such as diet, as status, migration, and sex have impacted disease mortality. And she's particularly known for her work on the Black Death in London. And so that is what she's going to be talking about today. So take it away, Sharon.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I was so sad that we couldn't do this last year, but it definitely inspired me to visit Bologna eventually. So thank you for involving me in general. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully. Let's see, there we go. Okay, is that visible to? Okay, great. So yeah. So I'm gonna, now for something different, we're gonna move to London, which is where I have focused most of my research for over 15 years. So I'm gonna talk about the work that I've done, starting from when I was a graduate student many years ago, focusing initially on what happened during the Black Death, and then more recently looking at demographic and health patterns before and after that epidemic in London. So for over 15 years, most of my research has centered around the, around the 14th century Black Death. I am a bioarchaeologist, so that means that most of the data that I work with come from samples of human skeletal remains that have been excavated from archaeological contexts. And I mostly focus on population level trends in mortality, survival, and health. And like other scholars have before me, I take the perspective that the Black Death was an emerging disease of the 14th century, and that clarifying the context of its emergence and also its effects can potentially improve our understanding of other emerging diseases, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing now. So the Black Death had extraordinarily high mortality levels. For example, in England, where I do most of my research, it's estimated that it killed 30 to 60% of affected populations. And Bruce Campbell has estimated that amounted to over 2 million excess deaths during the Black Death. And then following the Black Death, there were periodic outbreaks of plague for centuries during what we now refer to as the second pandemic of plague. And that lasted up until the 19th century in some areas, such as the Ottoman Empire. And just so we're all on the same page, the first pandemic is also called the Plague of Justinian, which began in the 6th century CE. And then the third pandemic began in the 1800s. We now know conclusively that all of those pandemics were caused by the bubonic plague bacterium Yersinia pestis. So in England in particular, which is what I know most about, the Black Death emerged in the context of intense population pressures, increasing social inequality, increasing urbanization, and changing global climatic conditions that were associated with the end of the medieval climate anomaly and the transition to the Little Ice Age. So the prelude to and then the experience of the Black Death in London, I think, can provide us with a model for better understanding the confluence of urban environments, climate change, and emerging diseases. So going back to my initial interest in the Black Death, I was motivated primarily by my broader interest in a phenomenon called selective mortality. So specifically with respect to the Black Death, I was really interested initially in estimating mortality patterns during the epidemic and testing the often made assumption that the Black Death killed indiscriminately. And that would make it different from most causes of death, which do tend to be selective. So that means that they tend to disproportionately kill the frailest or the least healthy individuals in a population. Many people have assumed that because because of its very high mortality levels, that the Black Death did kill indiscriminately. But that assumption about indiscriminate mortality largely remained unexamined until recently. Bioarchaeologists such as myself, we do have the potential to test that assumption empirically because there are skeletal remains of victims of the Black Death that can provide us with very rich data, evidence about mortality patterns that are not available in written records, which tend to exclude many people from past populations, including women in general, and also many impoverished people. So the reason that bioarchaeological work on the Black Death is possible is because during the epidemic in many areas, emergency burial grounds were established to identify or to bury the victims, and they are identifiable from written records. They are distinguishable from other burials. And one of those burial grounds I'm showing in this slide here during excavation, and that is the East Smithfield Cemetery from London. This cemetery was part of a larger site called the Royal Mint site that was excavated in the 1980s. And that's what I'm showing in this slide was a picture taken during excavation. East Smithfield is one of a relatively small number of large excavated cemeteries in Europe, in Afro-Eurasia in general, that has strong documentary and archaeological evidence linking it specifically to the Black Death. We know from the contemporary records that it was established for the sole explicit purpose of burying victims of the coming plague before it even arrived in the city. It was used only during the duration of the Black Death in London from about 1349 to 1350. No evidence, archaeological or documentary, that it was used after the Black Death. And so what that means is that all of the people buried there died during the Black Death, and that means that most of those, if not all of those individuals, were victims of that specific epidemic. And so we can use the remains of the people who were buried there to investigate mortality patterns. As I mentioned, the site was excavated in the 1980s, and that excavation yielded over 700 individuals, many of whom were buried within individual graves. So that was a single individual within a grave cut. And there were also hundreds of people who were buried within mass burial trenches, but very, very carefully interred in those trenches. And all of those individuals are now curated at the Museum of London Center for Human Bioarchaeology. So what I did with my initial work was compare a sample of nearly 500 people from East Smithfield to a large sample of people who died under presumably normal mortality conditions prior to the Black Death. And within both of those samples, I examined 3 major patterns of mortality. So the first was whether there were discernible differences in risks of death between individuals estimated to be male versus those estimated to be female. So I was looking at sex differences. Secondly, I looked at whether there was selectivity with respect to pre-existing health conditions, or more simply put, selectivity with respect to frailty. In the case of the Black Death burial ground, what I was interested in was whether people who were already in poor health, or who at least we can determine had been exposed to physiological stressors prior to the Black Death, if subsequently they faced higher risks of death during the epidemic compared to their peers who had been in relatively good health up until the point of the Black Death. And then lastly, I was interested in whether there was any variation in risk of death across the lifespan. So in order to do that work, I estimated age at death for all of the individuals in my samples. For those of you who are super interested in age estimation methods, I can answer questions about that. I will just say now that I used a method of estimation for adults, which is a Bayesian approach that allows for age estimates, even for the oldest individuals in the sample, which is different from conventional methods that can only yield very broad, open-ended terminal categories. So I was actually able to look at patterns at the latest adult ages. I estimated sex for adults. And then for all of the individuals, I looked for the presence of a variety of skeletal stress markers or skeletal lesions. I'm showing 3 here. I'm, again, happy to answer any questions that people have about these and what their etiologies might be. But what I'll say now is that I don't try to establish any specific cause of these stress markers. I use them to get a general sense of whether somebody was exposed to stressors, a stressor or stressors prior to death. And I should note that in the case of the Black Death, none of these stress markers I'm showing here, none of the others that I included in my study are attributable to the Black Death itself. And that's because these sorts of stress markers take weeks, months to form. So that's much too long a period of time for these to be possibly caused by the Black Death itself, which killed within days of onset of symptoms, unless people recovered. So these stress markers I use as an indicator of exposure to stress and a measure of health. So my general approach in this research and in much of my work is the application of hazards analysis. So what I do is I fit parametric models or semi-parametric models of mortality to these sorts of cemetery data. And the nice thing about these models is that those that have relatively few parameters can be applied to the small sample sizes that are typical of bioarchaeology. They accommodate missing data, and they can smooth the random variation in data that is often an artifact of small sample sizes, but they don't impose any particular pattern on those data. So just to give you an example of one of the models I've used, this is a multi-state model that was developed by Bethany Usher specifically for bioarchaeological purposes. And this, oops, I keep doing that. This is a model that allows me to examine risks of death associated with various stress markers, which I've put as a shorthand lesion in this slide. So this is a 3-state model. There are 2 living states, and then the 3rd state is death. Clearly, everybody that I study is in the that third state. So the states 1 and 2 represent the states that individuals could have been in prior to that transition to death into the skeletal sample. So state 1 includes people who lack a particular stress marker. State 2 includes people who exhibit a particular stress marker. And the model allows me to estimate differences in risk of death between those 2 living states, between people with and without stress markers. And what this allows me to do is determine if individuals who had stress markers experienced higher risks of death compared to their age peers who don't have those stress markers. And this is an important feature of the model because it allows me to address aspects of the osteological paradox that was described by Jim Wood and his colleagues over 25 years ago. And one of the things that they raised in that paper was that it is possible that skeletal stress markers might not always indicate poor health, even though that's how they're very often interpreted within bioarchaeology. And this possibility is based on the fact, as I mentioned, that skeletal lesions take time to form. And so a person who exhibits a stress marker had to have been minimally healthy enough, resilient enough to survive a stressor long enough to produce a stress marker in response to that stressor. Whereas somebody who lacks a stress marker might lack it because they were so frail that they died shortly after exposure to a stressor, and thus their skeleton didn't have time to produce a stress marker in response. And so what Jim Wood and his colleagues suggested is that the presence of a stress marker, what that indicates is exposure to a stressor, but a lack of a stress marker is much more difficult to interpret. So what this model allows me to do is estimate risks of death associated with those stress markers. And if the parameters of this model indicate within a particular context that a specific stress marker is associated with an elevated risk of mortality, then I'm comfortable inferring that that stress marker in that context reflects higher frailty or poorer health. It is also possible, however, that the parameter estimate will indicate that a stress marker is associated with lower risks of mortality, in which case I would infer that in that context, that stress marker reflects relatively good health or lower frailty. So basically, in all of my work, I'm using demographic measures ultimately to assess health, and I'll return to that in a moment. So for my project, what I did was initially evaluate these relationships within the pre-Black Death normal mortality sample to determine whether those stress markers I had selected are associated with elevated risks of mortality under normal conditions and therefore potentially useful for examining selective mortality during the Black Death. And then in order to examine sex patterns of mortality, I estimated the effect of sex as a covariate affecting an adult model, a model of adult mortality, the Gompertz-Maka model, and then to look at variation across the lifespan in general from birth onwards, I estimated the parameters of the Seiler model. And that's what the graph in this figure is representing. It's just a hypothetical Seiler model. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about the specific parameters for those of you who are interested. But for now, what I'll do is just jump to the major, what I see as the major take-home points of my previous research, which is that those analyses revealed evidence that contradicts the assumption that the Black Death killed indiscriminately. And instead, what I found was evidence that older adults faced higher risks of death compared to younger adults, and that at all ages, people who had been exposed to physiological stressors prior to the Black Death were at higher risk of death during the epidemic than people who had no evidence of such exposure. So more directly, it looks like people who were frail experienced higher risks of death than people who were more healthy. I did not detect any significant effect of sex. I do not at all think that that means that there was no difference between the sexes in risks of mortality. I just wasn't able to detect it. There is more recent evidence from historical data from the Netherlands that does indicate that women faced higher risks of death during the Black Death and subsequent outbreaks of plague, at least in the Netherlands. And that's data from historical documents. So generally, the patterns that I found in this study, the patterns were similar between the Black Death and the normal mortality sample, which to me, suggests that we should always expect mortality to be selective, regardless of the conditions, catastrophic or not. One of the things that I'm very interested in, particularly given the context that I study, is the effect of social status on health and mortality. There is no independent information about social status within the East Smithfield Cemetery. People were not buried with any funerary objects. There's no way to tie individual skeletons to specific named individuals. So there's no way to actually assess social status for this sample. But work using historical documents since my original research has revealed evidence of variation in mortality by wealth, social position, or household size, which likely reflects socioeconomic status during the Black Death and later outbreaks in England and in other contexts. So this does suggest that, at least in some contexts, medieval and early modern plague did disproportionately affect lower status and impoverished people. So this work that I did, this initial work suggesting that people did vary in their risks of death during the Black Death, and what we know about the very high mortality during the epidemic, raised several questions that I attempted to address with more recent research. And one of those questions was whether the population, at least of England, was particularly vulnerable to a new disease, to the Black Death, because of poor general health. Ancient DNA analyses of Black Death victims, including those buried in East Smithfield, have confirmed that the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis, and I'm showing a picture of Yersinia pestis in this slide. This is the bacterium that causes bubonic plague today. So we know that the Black Death was plague. But there are really important epidemiological differences between the Black Death and what has been observed in recent outbreaks of bubonic plague. So within the third pandemic that began in the 1800s. As I mentioned, in some contexts, the Black Death killed as much as 60%, even more, of affected populations. Modern outbreaks of plague, so for example, in 1904 in India, at most killed 2 to 3% of affected populations. That's a terribly high number of people, but it's clearly a much lower proportion of the overall population that was killed. And this is prior to antibiotic treatment. So it's not simply an artifact of medical intervention. Now, so far, genetic analyses, genomic analyses haven't revealed anything functionally significant and unique to the 14th century strain of Yersinia pestis that would explain why it was so deadly. And so what I think that means that we have to really attend to the human population affected by the Black Death to see what factors might have contributed to high mortality levels at the time. So look beyond the pathogen itself and look at the human biological demographic context, health context. Now, the skeletal stress markers that I mentioned that I used in my previous study, those can be produced by malnutrition and episodes of infectious disease. And we have mounting evidence from contemporary populations that early life stressors shape immunity and resilience later in life. And exposures to stressors can have intergenerational effects via epigenetic changes. A lot of the work that's been done on these phenomena does focus on non-communicable diseases, but there was a paper that came out last year that found that descendants of survivors of the Great Chinese Famine from 1958 to 1962, those descendants faced higher risks of tuberculosis 2 generations later. So now we're starting to see evidence of intergenerational changes, intergenerational effects of exposures to famine conditions with respect to infectious disease. So all of this together begs the question of what were trends in health like prior to the Black Death? Was the population vulnerable to a new disease because of poor general health resulting from crises that had occurred across several generations? And then the other major question that I've been interested in addressing is what effect the selective mortality during the Black Death might have had on health and demography in its aftermath, particularly what we know from written records about improvements in standards of living, at least temporarily, in England after the Black Death. So in order to address these two questions, I took advantage of cemeteries from London that have very good chronological control. And I'm going to show you a map that obviously pales in comparison to maps that have been shown already today. So this is a map of London circa 1300, and I've circled the location on this map of the 4 cemeteries that I have focused on going back to 2007. And I use this map mostly because I want to highlight, not only am I focusing on London, I'm focusing within basically a mile within London. So these cemeteries were relatively close to one another, and their catchment areas would also have been relatively close to one another. So over the last few years, I have been collecting data from over 2,000 individuals across these cemeteries that I can assign to one of 3 time periods, which I've referred to as the early pre-Black Death period from 1000 to 1200 CE, the late pre-Black Death period from 1200 to 1250, and then the post-Black Death period from 1350 to 1540. And I take the view, as a lot of people who work at the population level and are interested in health, I take the view that survivorship is a reflection of general levels of health. And basically the idea is, how long on average are people avoiding the ultimate poor health outcome, which is death? So in populations that have generally good levels of health, life expectancies, survivorship is long. And in populations in which health is generally poor, life expectancy, survivorship is much shorter. So what I did was I compared the early and late pre-Black Death periods, and then the late pre-Black Death period and the post-Black Death period, looking at survivorship across those periods using Kaplan-Meier survival analysis. I used an approach to attempt to control for fertility. I mean, given that we're talking about a time with really important demographic changes, it is important within bioarchaeology to control for fertility, because changes in fertility can alter skeletal age at death distributions, even if age-specific mortality does not change over time. And so I wanted to make sure that any changes that I might have observed with respect to survivorship are not an artifact of changes in birth rates across those same time periods. So I use this ratio of people above the age of 30 to those above the age of 5. Bijkstra and her colleagues found that there is a strong negative relationship between this ratio and birth rates. So it can give you an idea of patterns of fertility. And I've also looked at trends in skeletal stress markers. I'm going to focus in the interest of time today on what I found looking at tibial length. So the tibia is one of the bones in the shin, in the lower leg. Tibial length as a proxy for adult stature. Stature, among other things, can reflect exposure to physiological stress during development. I did find previously that short stature was associated with elevated risks of mortality in the context of medieval London. So I feel comfortable using it as a skeletal measure of health. So I'll start with what I found with respect to survivorship. And on this slide, I'm showing the numerical estimates. The next slide, I will show graphs for those of you who like images. So what I found with Kaplan-Meier survival analysis is evidence that there were reductions in survivorship for both sexes in the 13th century compared to the 11th and 12th centuries. So basically, fewer people were living to later adult ages in that late pre-Black Death period compared to the earlier period. And then following the Black Death, there were improvements in survivorship. And then here I have the survival functions for separated by males and females. The same pattern emerges when I pooled sexes and included people of indeterminate sex. So what you're seeing in both the functions for estimated females and estimated males is the early pre-Black Death function is shown in red. The late pre-Black Death function drops below that. So that's a reduction in survivorship. And then the post-Black Death function is shown in gray. There's an improvement in survivorship. So survivorship declines beforehand and then improves after the Black Death. And then these are the fertility proxies. The actual numerical estimates for those proxies for that ratio does vary over time, but the comparison intervals overlap substantially. So that indicates that there really is no substantial or significant change in that ratio across time, which would suggest that the patterns that I'm seeing with respect to survivorship are not simply an artifact of changes in birth rates. And then for stature, what I found was that, and what I'm showing in this chart is tibial lengths in millimeters. And what it suggests is that stature for males decreased significantly in the late pre-Black Death period and then increased significantly after the Black Death. For females, however, for estimated females, there wasn't a significant change from the early to late pre-Black Death period, but there was a significant decrease in stature, estimated stature, for females after the Black Death. So there's a disparate pattern for males, estimated males and females across this time period. So I'll start with what I think is being reflected by those survival analyses. So again, the results suggest decreases in survivorship before the Black Death, improvements afterwards. Those pre-Black Death trends were occurring in the context of repeated famines that are attributed to global climate changes associated with the end of the medieval climate anomaly, which in England, as in other places, is also referred to as the medieval warm period because it was warmer. The pre-Black Death period was also characterized by increasing urbanization, which would have produced crowded and unhygienic conditions for at least some inhabitants within London. This was also a time of increasing social inequalities in England. So what we might be seeing here is famine, disease, which we know is attendant to famine conditions, and increasing social inequalities, particularly in access to food. Individually and synergistically might have exacerbated vulnerabilities to a new disease before the Black Death emerged. And that might have made the epidemic more deadly than it would have been if it had struck a more resilient population. Now, clearly, the samples I'm working with do predate the Black Death by several generations. So I have skeletal data up to 1250. The Black Death did not hit England until 1348. So you might ask, is it possible that these apparent declines in health might have improved after 1250? Well, evidence that we have from historical documents would not support that. And in fact, it looks like conditions got even worse after 1250. So there were, from 1250 on to the Black Death, there were several severe famines. There was a famine from 1256 to 1260 in England that might have been as deadly as the better known Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed an estimated 10 to 15% of the population of England. That was followed shortly after by the Great Bovine Pestilence in 1319 to 1320, which killed approximately 62% of bovines in England and Wales. And that led to long-term dairy deprivations and animal protein deprivations for people up until the 1330s. These sorts of famine conditions would have had disproportionate effects on poorer people who were at the end of the 1200s and into the 1300s, making up an increasing proportion of the population of England. So afterwards, again, there's evidence from the skeletal data of an improvement in survivorship, which would suggest improvements in health after the epidemic. And what happened after the Black Death in England was a severe shortage of laborers, which was also true for other contexts. But in England, what that led to, at least temporarily, were improvements in real wages and decreases in costs for food and housing and other things. And this, it has been suggested to have led to improvements in diet and particularly decreases in social inequalities in diet after the Black Death. And this in turn might have led to improvements in general levels of health because diet strongly influences immune competence. There was also apparently an increase in migration following the Black Death, in part because people were no longer tied to their pre-Black Death labor obligations. So these apparent changes from the skeletal evidence following the Black Death might have been the result of a relatively short-term so-called harvesting effect of the epidemic. It might reflect a longer-term selective effect of the Black Death, perhaps affecting human genetic loci associated with disease susceptibility or immune competence. It might reflect the improvements in diet that have been noted in historical records. It might reflect the migration of young, healthy people into London. So as with a lot of research, I try to answer one question and then it just raises a whole slew of new questions, which is why it's interesting to do this kind of work. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about is what is going on potentially with those stature results. So what we're seeing for males is a nice congruence of the demographic and stress marker results. So we have survivorship decreasing and stature decreasing beforehand, which suggests declining health for males. And then we have improvements in survivorship and increases in stature for males after the Black Death, which suggests improvements in health. But for females, estimated females, the results are less straightforward. By itself, the significant decrease in female stature after the Black Death might suggest increased physiological stress during childhood, and thus decreases in general health for females after the Black Death. But the decline in stature might actually reflect improvements in diet and health for females after the epidemic. And I say that because in contemporary populations, improvements in nutrition and reduced disease burdens have been associated with earlier age at menarche, so first menses. And furthermore, in some contemporary populations, there are positive associations between age at menarche and adult stature and height. And that's because menarche is associated with a surge of estrogen, which is also responsible for closure of the growth plates within bones. So once a female, a body with ovaries achieves menarche, there's very little further growth in stature. So what this means is that in lots of populations today, a later age at menarche is associated with taller stature, an earlier age at menarche is associated with shorter stature. So if nutritional status and or disease burdens improve substantially following the Black Death in London, that might have resulted in an earlier average age at menarche in post-epidemic populations, and therefore earlier cessation of growth in females and shorter stature. So it's a paradoxical short stature might actually be reflecting relatively good conditions, at least for females. So recently I collaborated with Mary Lewis at University of Reading, who had previously collected skeletal data on pubertal timing from the same samples that I've analyzed from London. And I analyzed her data and I found evidence that indeed the average age at menarche after the Black Death appears to have decreased compared to pre-Black Death conditions. However, nothing in bioarchaeology is ever straightforward. So it's possible that these results might have been affected by the migration of young, healthy females from rural areas into London. It's also possible that what I'm seeing, this disparity in findings for males and females, might suggest that males benefited disproportionately from improvements in standards of living, including better diets following the epidemic. So that just opens up avenues for more research. So very briefly, I want to highlight collaborative work that I'm doing now in order to address these questions that this previous work raised. So basically, this project that I'm working on now is geared at examining the mechanisms driving those apparent changes in health before and after the Black Death, as well as looking at mechanisms that increased risks of death during the Black Death. So this project I'm doing with Janet Montgomery and Julia Beaumont, who are both isotope experts in the UK. So we're going to integrate isotopic data informative about diet and migration with paleodemographic and paleopathological data. And I'm also involved in another project that is looking at human genetic variation across this time period. So the project looking at diet and migration and health and demography will help contextualize the findings of that other project. So one of the things that we're looking at is carbon and nitrogen isotopes, which are reflective of diet, to look not just at changes in diet across the medieval period in England, but specifically whether those changes were equally enjoyed by everyone, regardless of age, sex, and status. And whether, if there were substantial changes, did those actually lead to changes in health and survivorship? One of the things that we're doing is we're using an approach called incremental dentin analysis to look not just at bulk diet within an individual, but also better resolution of changes in diet during an individual's lifetime, during development. And this approach will allow us to identify individuals who experienced famine conditions but survived them, so that we can evaluate what that experience meant with respect to later adult health and survivorship in the context of the Black Death and also normal mortality conditions. So far, we have initial data just from the post-Black Death period, and those data indicate that high status individuals following the Black Death consumed higher quality diets compared to lower status individuals. And that is contrary to what we expected from the historical literature, which suggested that there were decreasing social inequalities after the epidemic. But there's definitely much more work to be done. The other thing that we're doing is using strontium, oxygen, and lead isotope data to identify people who were migrants to London across the medieval period, to evaluate trends in migration and also the health status of migrants before, during, and after the Black Death. One of the things that we're going to potentially do is test the migrant selectivity hypothesis, that migrants were a select subpopulation of healthy individuals, versus the possibility that migrants would have been at higher risk of death from diseases that were endemic within London that they did not experience in rural areas earlier in life. Recently, I've started collaborating with Rebecca Redfern at the Museum of London and Joseph Hefner at Michigan State and Dorothy Kim at Brandeis, using my age estimation data with estimates of population affinity. And so far, those that analysis has suggested that people who migrated into the city experienced higher risks of death during the Black Death. So there's much more work to be done, but that's I'm really excited to see how that's going to change not just our understanding of health patterns, but also the heterogeneity within London, which we often think of as a white space, but was not at all. It was much more diverse than many people imagine. And then lastly, another part of this project is to compare patterns during the Black Death within a rural context to those that occurred in London. And that's based on a sample from Lincolnshire that is a Black Death burial. So just to wrap this up, I want to emphasize that bioarchaeological work, we do clearly focus on the remains of dead people, on their skeletal remains, but ultimately bioarchaeologists such as myself, we're interested in the living. So we're interested in the lived experiences of people in the past, and we're also interested in doing work that might actually be beneficial for living people today. And so plague is particularly important to study because it has caused pandemics for several hundred years, and it has the bubonic plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, has infected people for at least 5,000 years. So this is a disease that's not simply a recent phenomenon. And so looking at how it's behaved in its different historical iterations might actually give us some tools for understanding how it behaves today and predicting how it might behave in the future. And then more generally, I think that it's important to, with bioarchaeological work, what it does is it provides the human context that's really important for understanding disease and health in the past and today. And what are the interactions between pathogens, human biology, human demography, socio-political, economic conditions, climatic conditions. Singer and Claire wrote a paper, a seminal paper about syndemics in 2003, in which they emphasize that infectious diseases are never only biological in their nature, their course, or their impact. And I think one of the most important things that we might learn from research on the Black Death is that social inequality, deleterious conditions for poor urban inhabitants, and famine might have affected health prior to the epidemic, and it might have made the epidemic worse than it would have been otherwise. And the sorts of inequalities that existed in pre-Black Death populations have been reproduced since then. We're seeing now how impoverished and socially marginalized people are at higher risk of death from COVID. So I think that if we can emphasize to people the deep history of the structural conditions that shape human health and that continue to be reproduced today, like racism and poverty and marginalization, showing that deep history can actually benefit living people, because it undermines the idea of health being a matter of individual responsibility. So this idea that people are at elevated risk of disease and death because of choices that they make. And if we can undermine that perspective, this will counter tendencies to blame the victims and to excuse us as a society, as individuals, for not rectifying those structures that actually create the conditions that are embodied and put people at risk of disease and death. And then lastly, I think the Black Death is particularly useful in this respect because everyone I've ever met is interested in the Black Death. So there's an inherent interest in this one specific historical epidemic that I think we should tap into, not to generate fear about epidemics, but to show people we have a deep history of this in our species. We should learn from these past epidemics and do something proactively to reduce risks for people in the future. So with that, I will happily acknowledge all of the people and funding sources that have helped me to do this work. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that fascinating and just overall very inspiring talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have we can do a few questions now and then move to, Lola?
I had just one quick question. You mentioned that in the cemeteries that you studied, you had single graves and mass graves.
Yes.
Could that be used as a social marker?
I had hoped so. So that is one of the suggestions, is that perhaps the individual graves were reserved for people who were wealthier, who actually had the means to pay for a much more labor-intensive form of burial, and that the mass burial trenches were for people who were poorer, whose families could not afford those burials, the individual burials. However, there's no relative temporal information. There's no intercutting of the individual and mass burial trenches within East Smithfield. So there's no way of knowing whether they were used at the same time or if they were used sequentially. So it is possible that the individual graves were used when mortality was relatively low, and there was more time to devote to those much more time and labor intensive burials, and that the mass trenches were used when mortality was peaking. And so it was a much more efficient way of burying the bodies. So because it's not clear, several years ago, what I did was an analysis of patterns of stress markers among individuals within the individual graves versus those in the mass trenches. But it was like assumption built on assumption built. So the assumption is individuals who were impoverished would have experienced higher rates of those stress markers, which is a problematic assumption. So I did the analysis, and there were no significant differences in the frequencies of those stress markers between people in individual and mass burial trenches. And because there was no significant difference, it's uninterpretable. If I had found a difference, I would have been much more confident making some sort of interpretation, some sort of inference, but the lack of a difference, it doesn't mean there was no difference. It's just I'm not detecting a signal. So there's nothing that I can extract from that. I will say, however, that the existence of those individual graves are indistinguishable from non-plague individual graves, from normal graves within England. They in the midst of the catastrophe, they took a lot of care and time and treated the bodies with respect. And the same is actually true of the bodies within the mass burial trenches. They were all put in very, very carefully. They weren't just tossed in. So all of the people there, at least what we can infer from the burial practices, were treated with a lot of care and respect. So
thank you very much. And
thank you for your question.
For this very, very inspiring presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So maybe we'll do one more question and then we'll move to our discussant, and then we can come back and have a sort of general question and answer. Let's see, maybe Claire, if you want to just ask a quick question.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for a very lucid presentation. I thought it was amazing how you did that difficult topic. I just have a question about the relationship between famine and plague beyond the poor diets and heightened vulnerability to plague. Do you also have thoughts on the time span between the outbreak of a famine and plague? And I'm asking this because looking at 15th century Low Countries sources, you see in many cases that so about once every 15 or 20 years they're recording outbreaks of plague, and nearly in many cases this is in tandem with the recording an outbreak of a famine, or maybe 6 months beforehand they are talking about famine, and then 6 months later they're talking about plague. And these famines are several reasons. It has to do with climate conditions, but also warfare, for instance. They're not able to. So I was interested if there are also ideas about sort of very acute, urgent stress conditions that might be creating sort of extra vulnerability to plague.
Yeah, that is something I'm definitely interested in. Many people have observed this trend of famine conditions, so climate change, famine conditions, epidemic disease.
Yeah.
There are people who have attributed the plague of Justinian to pre-existing famine conditions. I've done work with Phil Slavin looking at his data on the Great Bovine Pestilence and my data on paleopathology, trying to link people who experienced the Great Bovine Pestilence, based on estimated ages of people who died during the Black Death, because we know when they died. We can then determine which of those individuals would have been in utero or infancy or early development during the Great Bovine Pestilence, those who would have been past those critical developmental periods during those. And we did see a little bit of a signal with respect to stature. The thing that I'm so excited about with that incremental dentin analysis is we have from the St. Mary's Spital Cemetery from London, individuals who are in mass burial graves there that are not plague because they're pre-Black Death. So they're almost, the evidence suggests that they were famine burials. So what we have is individuals who are buried under presumably normal mortality conditions, people who were buried under famine conditions, most likely people who died during the Black Death, people who died during plague after the Black Death. So like the 1361 Pestis Secunda. So we can actually, with that incremental dentin analysis, tie previous experience of nutritional stress to mortality outcomes under normal conditions, under famine conditions, under plague conditions. So we can actually look at accumulation of events. Now, ideally, if we actually could get DNA and actually be able, or maybe biodistance data to actually tie families together, we could actually track intergenerational effects. So life course effects within a single individual, as well as intergenerational effects. Now that's like pie in the sky. I'm not sure it will happen, but definitely like the within a life course and that perspective we can get at. So we have a sample of the data are still coming in. The pandemic clearly interfered with it, but we'll have data for over 200 individuals with that incremental dentin analysis, looking at diet across childhood. So it'll be the largest sample of that kind that has ever been generated. So we will have some pretty good statistical power, which is not often the case with this kind of work. So I'm optimistic that we'll be able to see something really interesting.
Thank you very much. It's very exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to move to our discussant, Professor Nicholas Terpstra. So he is at the University of Toronto, and his work focuses on Renaissance and early modern Italy and Europe, particularly looking at spatial analysis, sensory history, and his work often more broadly intersects with issues pertaining to gender, religion, and politics. And he's the principal investigator for the Deschamps Project, which has mapped in GIS data for 16th and 17th century Florence census data, and also data relating to the 1630 plague. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Taylor, and thanks for asking me to be part of this. I just have a few comments, maybe, because I think there's a lot of people on this call who who are better placed to ask questions than I am. But I wanted to start off with just congratulations to all three of you. This is extraordinary data that you're bringing forward, and the way you're using digital means to get more out of the archival sources is really really phenomenal. And I think the other thing that many of us realize too is just how incredibly time consuming it is. So you present these elegant maps, each of you, and I think we're all aware that those maps only come after an extraordinary amount of very hard work. So congratulations to all of you for that. What I thought was interesting about, we're looking at Healthscaping, and we really have three different kinds of sources. Taylor's looking at regulatory sources. Rosa's looking at fiscal sources. Sharon's looking at archaeological and biological sources. And with each one, that we can see how digital means, mapping and others, allow us to put these into conversation with each other. And then one of the great things about digital means is that they allow us to see things differently and then ask different questions. So see convergences, see intersections. And I think that so much of what's exciting about this work on Healthscaping is precisely the opportunity to see things differently and to see then, identify paradoxes, things like that, which we've all seen, particularly in Sharon's talk. The older documentary history would have foregrounded political, social, and religious realities. I think that some of the newer digital work allows us to overlay a grid of demographic, health, and environmental realities that allows us then to really, I think, get methodologically to what we've seen as a turn in historiography towards intersectional analysis and towards entanglement as well. I think that really comes up in what we've looked at. Guy mentioned the contemporary interest in mapping that's come up during the COVID epidemic, and how we're all watching these maps and looking at these maps to see outbreaks, to interpret social distinctions, gender distinctions, all the rest. I think that what we've also seen in the last couple of years is that awareness of the immediacy of the problem does not always result in appropriate action. And I think what we've seen in Healthscaping, as Sharon mentioned, and also in environmental legislation generally over the last, say, 10, 20 years, is that even when faced with an existential crisis, we often have political elites which move the other way, and will often quite overtly resist what the data shows. And I think that's the kind of thing we might also want to think about as we're looking at some of these things. So the fact that there's an emergency here doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to act to deal with it. They may act precisely to make it worse. And again, the past, I think, 20 years shows that really strongly. So one of the things that I would encourage us to look at is, when we're looking at things like socioeconomic regulations, what are the costs of them? Who pays the costs? And who uses position to avoid paying the costs or pushing those costs on others? Who uses the political system, the prescriptions, the prosecutions, to find ways around some of the problems that we see, or at least to push them onto others rather than onto themselves? So that, and again, one thing we've seen often in earlier work on regulation with prescription sources is that the frequency of regulation often means that it's ineffective, right? So the more often laws are passed, the less effective they are. So there's always paradoxes in how we read these, and I think one of the things that's critical, as we've seen in all these presentations too, is who benefits and how do they maximize their benefit, because that just seems to be a constant. Just some quick things about a few of the papers directly, because I thought they were really phenomenal. I thought that just with Taylor's map, some of the maps, and I have to say that the maps are what always draw me in. The maps immediately demonstrate what she's talking about. And I thought one of the ones in particular for that, the distribution of artisans map, that slide, showing that the highest concentration of artisans is at the north end of the medieval city, which again is where the water exits, right? And so that that people, you get an immediate image there that shows how shops are located at the place where they will do, in a sense, less damage. There's, as Taylor was mentioning, there's a clear environmental logic in regulations. I also wonder about the status logic in them. I noticed, for instance, that you know, the two areas, when she mentioned the 5 areas where there's highest regulation, 2 of them are around mendicant sites, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The Dominican one, Taylor, you mentioned that this was where the water enters, and so it was very important for that to be kept clear. I noticed that there, actually, what you have is zoning regulations rather than water regulations. And I wonder if the Dominicans are protecting some other interests that they have, because it seems to be an extraordinary zone. It was nice that you had that marked out in red, because it just seemed to be like this throbbing zone of keep away. The Franciscans, by contrast, were concerned with waste. I'm not sure what that may indicate. So what I would ask generally there, Taylor, as you're moving further into this, is how status and environmental politics intersect, because I think that's the kind of thing that that we're also looking at. With Rosa's paper, I think what we see there is the real importance of fiscal sources, because for all of us as historians, you've got to follow the money, and you got to follow the money now. And I think what she shows us is what happens when you do that. So looking particularly with, you know, even within this group of the of guild members, she notes how political motivations and influences shape some of the regulations that are happening. So guilds protect their rights, the rights of their members over the public good. And so guilds sometimes ensure for themselves exemptions from some of the measures which are otherwise imposed to bring the public good to others. So, you know, things like that, I think that what her fiscal sources really do is underscore that. I was curious about some of the other things in relation to it, and curious about whether her parchment makers ever live away from their workshops, or can we assume that when parchment workers are living in an area, that is also where their workshops are? I mean, I kind of think it is, but what we're learning from so much about late medieval and early modern history is we've got to be prepared for the counterintuitive. And so I'm not sure whether there's a question there to ask. So there's any gaps between residences and workshops. The other thing I wanted to point out is what these maps have shown, both Taylor's and Rosa's have shown me very much, is that you can see over time a real shift in the area of production. So, but what both Taylor and Rosa were showing is that production in the late medieval city is really focused around the what is it? The southeast of the city, right? Southeast of the city. And my work on Bologna was more into the 16th, 17th century. And that's when things have really moved to the northwest, where the Reno Canal is. And it's interesting because there the scale of production is much higher. It's still an issue around water use, but what you have there is kind of quasi-industrial silk mills that are requiring large flows of water. So they're bringing the Reno Canal in, they're bringing things like that in. It was interesting to see that shift over time from, let's say, smaller scale artisanal production, and the focus then on the east side of the city, southeast of the city, and then the shift upwards. I had never kind of processed that before, but your map again brought it out immediately. The other thing I think it shows, because you were both showing that where the walls are, is what we know is that the area, particularly as you move into the Renaissance and early modern period, that area between the second and third set of walls, that really becomes the industrial area, and that becomes the slum area. And you find that, certainly I found that also in my work in Florence as well, that the industrial slum area is that area between the second and third set of walls. And I would say anybody who's going to be in Bologna, what you should do is walk that area, and you'll notice as you walk out the streets, as you walk out the old gates in that second set of walls, you immediately see a decrease in the size of buildings. And there's things about the physicality that I think also tie into our interest in spatiality. Then to Sharon, I quite don't know what to say, because I thought I'll follow Claire and say I was surprised I could follow it all because it was so lucid. So I wanted to thank you, Sharon, very much. It was clear. And what I thought you brought out as well is, like I was mentioning earlier, the paradoxes, how much is counterintuitive here. And I thought, the key thing is that, the improvement of health may actually make, at least in the case of gender, when we intersect the improvement of health and gender, it may actually make for a shorter stature in women because of the effects, as you said, on menarche. I had no clue. And I think because, so much of what we looked at before was saying, okay, nutrition equals health, equals height, equals size, all the rest. And again, the kind of duh moment where you realize that no, when you put gender into that equation, of course, gender and biology, it moves things it can move things in a different way. I think the other thing you mentioned is the impact of migration, which again, I'm dealing with a slightly later period, but migration is very much key to what's going on in the new work that's going on in early modern period as well, because at that point we're looking at migration, not just urban-rural, or rural-urban rather, but also global. And so I think it's going to be very important for early modernists to be taking some of what you're finding about the health effects and the biological effects to see that, again, the paradox that the healthier people may actually be more vulnerable. As in a sense, we already know through the Columbian exchange that, the effect of disease that Europeans brought to other parts of the world was extraordinarily devastating. So I will, so those are just a few comments and a few questions. I think, again, like I said, I think people on this call have far more intelligent things to ask than I do. So I'll just leave it at that. And again, but for all of us, thank you for 3 extraordinary presentations that I think show the promise in healthscaping as well. So this is a great move.
Thank you very much for that. So I guess we can open up to questions, or I don't know if any of the presenters want to just respond individually to any of the questions that Nick raised.
I can give some response.
Yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your kind words and for the very inspiring questions. The question regarding the shifting of industrial activities, we have to bear in mind that there are activities which need water, need clean water. The clean water is in the south, in the southern part of the city. In the northern part of the city, the Reno Canal, the Cavaticcio, the Reno Canal you mentioned, the water there is not clean, but yes, many activities, including the silk production, was established in that area, in the northwest part of Bologna. Also paper mills. Paper mills were in the north part of the city because they do not need clean water. So we have to bear in mind especially what kind of quality of water the industry does need. This is the question regarding the work of residents and the site of the residence and the workshop. Well, of course, this is not automatic, but when you see a pattern of parchment makers living in the same site and you have a clean water just there, of course you can understand that they live where they work. But this is not for all the artisans, of course, because there are artisans, they can live, they are not absolutely forced to live in a certain area of the city because they do not need special resources. I think this is the most important thing you have to bear in mind when we want to understand residents and workshop are in the same place. First of all, what kind of resources the artisans do need. For parchment makers, we know. Of course, I want to add something. The shops can be in a different place, but the workshop is tied to the availability of water. So we know, for speaking about the Villola I mentioned in my short paper, the Villola, they had, of course, workshop in that part of the city, the southeastern part of the city, but the shops for selling was in Piazza Maggiore. It was right, in some case, it was right in the public building, in the town hall. So depends what kind of a stage of the industry. Is the retail, is the production, depends.
Yeah. Thank you. Sharon, I don't know if you want to respond to any of the comments.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to say to Nick how excited I am to hear you say intersectional, because this is something that actually applying intersectionality within bioarchaeology is an emerging, long overdue approach. And we're well past just cataloging and describing within bioarchaeology, but there sort of seems to be a hurdle for some of us to get over in terms of actually integrating multiple lines of evidence to actually do intersectionality. So, so the fact that you mentioned that, it's, you know, you're raising something that is an exciting development, and I'd be interested to know if in your own work or in work that's being done within Healthscapes by historians, if intersectionality is being engaged with substantially. If you have any examples or things I should be attending to.
I think it's a desideratum. So people want to do it. I think that there's more work now that is doing it. I don't know how much of it, and John Henderson may know better. I don't know how much of it is working with some of the biological and archaeological sources that you're looking at, but I think that's where you go straight to the heart of it, right? With that, and the way that you're able to then interpret, like I say, particularly interpret it counterintuitively, the meanings of what we're seeing with the analysis of the skeletons. So I don't have any particular historians to mention, but I can look into. I'll write to you. How's that?
That's wonderful. Thank you.
So I guess I can maybe just respond really briefly, and then we'll get to some questions. Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned about the mendicant orders and health being the sort of intersection of health status and politics. Yeah, that's something I am sort of starting to think about a little bit more now that I'm looking at the areas that were, you know, that you can identify the areas that were most heavily regulated and see that, yes, there's clearly a sort of status. If we think about the status of monastic institutions, or we think about the city center, the cathedral, there's clearly a status element there. And we can think about health or regulation really as an apparatus for control and for privileging some interests over others. So yeah, that is something that I'm sort of still kind of thinking about. And we can also compare the regulations and the statutes with their enforcement, right, with the Frango data that Guy is talking about. So then we sort of have another level of talking about, you know, sort of the difference between structure and practice, if you will. So, and that's something we can do with the map now that we have all of these layers on the map. So yeah, but I see there's a lot of questions, so we'll get to that. I saw Jana's first, and then maybe John. So Jana, if you want to.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. So thank you for the workshop in general, for all the talks. I just wanted to briefly follow up on what the discussion between Sharon and Nick about entanglement and intersections between different types of research. And what struck me when you were talking about sort of the unequal benefits of improvement, and that sort of idea of plague or epidemics as like a social equalizer is that I think it's really interesting to note that the assumption that people, oh, sorry, I just need to get my thoughts really quickly. So the assumption that you get a better position to negotiate wages and to negotiate your social position, of course, yeah, it's really biased towards the male population. So for those who in this very unequal society in terms of women and children, yeah, it seems really, it makes sense that they're not able to negotiate anything in the first place. And I've done some work on children, and I came across a very interesting article that showed that child labor after Black Death actually rose. So it seems very probable, or very at least fascinating, that for certain groups, having to work harder and more is not a good thing, to put it very bluntly. So yeah, I was very fascinated by that idea. And I think it also ties into a feminist discussion that has been going on for ages about sort of the golden age of work or emancipation for women after the Black Death, which I think is largely debunked by now among feminists that was the case. So just thank you for these insights. And yeah, I think there's a lot to follow up on. Yeah, in that sense.
Can I ask Jana, what was the article about child labor? Was it Mary Lewis or what?
No, it's by Francine Michaud.
Okay.
I can send it to you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you very much. I'm really,
it's kind of obscure, but it's
okay.
very
Yeah,
cool.
please do send it to me. That would be great. I'd really appreciate it.
All right.
So maybe let's go to John and then Lorenzo.
Hi. Thank you all very much for, as everybody else said, splendid talks. My question was for Taylor, and thank you for your very inspiring paper, I must say. It was really very interesting, and I'm sure it will lead other people to follow similar analysis elsewhere. My question was really about the statutes, and particularly the language that they use in reference to health and disease, and how far that might have reflected medical ideas at the time, or were they more pragmatic? Or, I mean, how would you define the type of language that they used?
Yeah, I think probably Guy would be the best to answer that, since he's written a lot about it. But I think that sometimes it's quite medical, where they mention specifically that it's causing, this is corrupting the air and this is causing disease. Or sometimes they'll talk about, for example, decaying meat, right? Decaying meat that's polluting the water. So that seems to have like a quite medical sort of undertone, a galenic undertone. Mm-hmm. And I think that other times it's quite practical. It's that, that dirt and filth is lingering in this area, and that if we pave it, then the water that is going to, the canal waters that are going to clean the streets can remove this material. So I think that you see kind of both. But what I think is quite interesting is that, and like Francesca Bocchi has written a lot about this, but that you do see, and Guy as well, that you see similar language throughout different cities in northern Italy. So this is just an example from Bologna, but you see similar language in terms of the justifications for some of these health regulations. So that water needs to be able to flow is something that you see throughout statutes, that we're doing this because water needs to be able to flow to remove waste, or that it's a finable offense to impede water infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So that there's sort of kind of a collective consciousness about how a city is supposed to be able to function.
Mm-hmm. And do you get neighborhoods or areas or members of parishes petitioning, and that maybe again is a question for Guy, and whether they repeatedly, I mean, I working in Florence, I know there was an area of the Arno which was particularly stinky, and there was a petition which referred back to another petition that the neighbours in a particular parish had presented to the commune, saying, that in the past, this has created disease. This smelly area in the Arno is going to create disease again unless you unblock it. So I was wondering if that sort of thing presumably is reflected in the statutes in a sort of general way, but I wonder whether also in specific individuals and parishes.
There are a couple of things. If I can add my voice before I
Sure.
fall asleep on the screen.
What time is it?
It's 1:30. I haven't done anything, any systematic search regarding petitions, but it's very clear from the people who are coming in our period to the Fango, so 13th, 14th century, even if it's not a formal petition or something elaborate where they would have to go to a notary, etc., that they're at least mobilizing medical discourse to argue for a particular change or to avoid a particular change when they're coming to the magistrates. So they would employ. Now, we know what they wanted to happen. We don't know that they believed in the medical paradigm that they were deploying, but they knew that it would be effective rhetoric, or they gambled on it being effective rhetoric. So in that sense, I think there's a fair bit of consistency there in a shared medical literacy or shared medical horizons that I think is fairly easy to document in some of the Italian city-states where we've been working at. It has been annoyingly difficult to find that in the Low Countries, certainly for the earlier part of the day. What I wanted to go back to your first question. I think one of the things that Taylor and I haven't done, and we're going to have to struggle to find a way to visualize this, and maybe you and Nick and others have suggestions. So looking at this amazing map that Taylor has created gives, from a Galenic perspective, a really good and rich picture. But what it doesn't show us is things, other emic aspects of this, of healthscaping, which would have been at the meso and macro level, right? So we're not just looking at the city and not even the flow of water, for example, or stratification within the city, but also we're looking at seasons. And in Bologna in particular, and we know this because we have the records, every year, grosso modo, there would be a prediction, right? So the astrologers and the doctors would come together and give advice to the city whether the stellar constellation that's coming up will be detrimental to health, and if so, why? And so we didn't do that kind of mapping. We not yet. We thought about doing things with some political events, some or cattle disease, and all these other general problems that were known to have been around, but we didn't look at what we're beginning to call the sort of the kineticism of the perception of health. So the interlink between the micro, sort of the human biological level, and all the way up to the stars. And those are the things that are, we know that they believed in these things, certainly at some level, and it's trickier to map that onto to those things. And that's something that I think John also, and Nick also in your, that are very, very specific, but always relevant to other places.
Thank you.
Rosa, did you want to jump in also? Did you have your hand up for the artisans at all?
Yes, I want to add that there was the possibility to have quite wise advices, because there was the medicine school, and some physicians were also very close to the city government, and they offered consilia in many cases. So possibly the people who wrote the statutes were consulting this sort of physicians time to time, at least, because there was quite a large group. For example, Taddeo Alderotti and his group, a very, very important, influential group of physicians, not only for Bologna, but for the region in general. That's all.
Thank you. So let's see, Lorenzo.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the very wonderful papers. They've been really fascinating. I just wanted to follow up on the social and political structure of 13th century Bologna, which has been touched upon during the discussion time, because I'm struck by the fact I seem to understand that the sources one can use to trace back the regulations about health all date to the middle of the 13th century on, right? So the statutes and the estimate, the fiscal sources. And this strikes me as, in my understanding, the development of the bureaucratic complexity of the communes. I think this applies to Bologna too. I'm sure of it for Tuscany, dates back in fact to the 12th century. So I kept wondering, why don't we have like sort of health regulations for the period for which we do see, for instance, tribunals developing, different sets of magistrates coming in, all this bureaucratic complexity that has already come into being during the 12th century. Why do we see health regulations only for a later period? And I was wondering if a possible research avenue, I think it's something that maybe has been done, but I'm not sure, is linking these regulations to a specific political structure characterizing the communes over the 13th century, which is the comune di popolo, so to speak. Because I kept thinking that this is part of, you know, a wider and intense activity of legislations which covered many aspects of human life. And another thing I was wondering is this linked to any kind of maybe annona politics, so provisions of food into the city? Because I see them coming into being in the late 12th century. Well, evidence is quite sketchy for the time, but for sure, city magistrates were providing food to a higher number of people during the 13th century. It's not just demographic growth, it's really political government of the city, which is specific to the 13th century. So I was wondering if these are research avenues which can be investigated to an extent. Maybe there's even an easier answer to all this. We don't have the right sources for earlier periods. Maybe there were statutes, but they haven't been preserved. So there's another thing I was curious about. And about the paper about London, this was just a questions I had, because I recently came up, sorry, I just bumped into, quite by chance, into a paper which stresses the different structure of international commerce after the plague in Italy. And this is a kind of commerce which is characterized by a great diversity of agricultural commodities which are traded by companies, and it is really different in comparison to the first half of the 14th century, in which we see great companies just commercing few goods. And I was wondering if looking at the structure of international commerce could be another way to test the way that diet varied before and after the plague. This is something that we began to do for Italy, but it's quite a recent research stream. I guess that for England there's much more, but I'm not sure about it because I don't know much. But yeah, I was just wondering if this was something that could be taken into account. And on top of all that, thank you very much again. This was really fascinating.
Thank you. So I don't know who wants to jump in with that multi-part question.
Well, I can briefly say that yes, during the 13th century, especially in the second half of the century, the Comune di Popolo, there were a lot of improvements in the social infrastructure, in the urban infrastructure in general, and also in the social infrastructure. So, but I remember, if I'm not very wrong, that also for previous period, we have quite a good attention for some kind of problems, some issues. I think a guy or Taylor can be more appropriate to say something about this. I think I have in mind just the work of the Scari, but just for mention, this very not late Roman, but early Middle Ages group of a team of people sent by the commune to verify sort of places in the cities. So, but I think Kai and Taylor can give an answer to Lorenzo. I thank you, Lorenzo, for the very interesting questions. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you for the answers.
Just really quickly, I think, Lorenzo, you hit on an important, I think for Taylor in particular, this was a methodological issue. So you go with statutes because statutes, especially in Italy, allow you to travel far and wide and also to draw comparisons, diachronically as well. So diachronically as well as synchronically. So I think that methodologically, that was a very good open path. But Rosa is absolutely right. Scari and Gina Fazzoli famously wrote the article on it, and this is in the Bolognese context. Statutes are very misleading. Statutes, apart from the fact that they're prescriptive sources with all those problems, statutes don't give us the birth of an institution. They give us other kinds of fantastic information. And in most of the cities that I worked in, it's the provisioni or various kinds of operative, ongoing discussions, let alone the administrative accounts, so fines, wills, things like that, that give you what's happening on the ground. In many cases, the first surviving set of statutes, which, operative word here is surviving, postdates the foundation of a particular institution or an organ of government. So so don't conclude from when Taylor begins to map according to the statute that this is what, and so there's no direction. And I completely would echo Rosa's hypothesis. All of these things happen when populations respond, governments and organizations like guilds respond to population density and to scarcity of resources. And that happens in different places, in different chronologies, but they do respond to it or even prepare for it. And that is a very idiosyncratic, specific question. And if you know what you're looking for, you will find it especially in Italy, in the very rich documentation.
Thank you for that, Guy. I don't know if Sharon, if you want to jump in about the diet question.
I have no answer. I'm fascinated by that suggestion, so I've made a note to look into it. So, so sadly, I don't have a good response for you. But thank you for revealing that to me.
It's fine. I would gladly forward the article, but it's in peer review now, so I really can't for a while.
Well,
but,
once it's no longer in peer review, I would love to see it. Thank you.
Welcome.
And I think just to add, because I think another thing just to add is that this is why we take sort of a multidisciplinary approach, because we can also look at the archaeology, right? Because we can look at the construction of various infrastructure and changes that are occurring that we may not see reflected in documentary evidence. So that's what one of the goals of this project is to see where they sort of concur, and then where we do see these divisions in different kinds of evidence, and really on different scales as well. So I don't know if there are any other questions. Let me see if I have any. Actually, I had a quick question for Sharon about children. I think we kind of touched maybe on the issue of children, but do you have any data for children in your samples? And what is it telling you?
So that is one of the so in bioarchaeology in general, we often face this issue of what's referred to as infant underenumeration for a variety of reasons. So poor preservation conditions or burial in a different location that's not excavated. And that is definitely affecting my data from London. So I have fewer infants and children than there should be in many of my cemetery samples. That's particularly true for the East Smithfield Black Death Cemetery. So a lot of the work that I've done, I mean, full disclosure, mostly to satisfy reviewers, I have focused on adults because it's less problematic from a sampling perspective. It's problematic for other reasons like age estimation. But I am incredibly interested in what is happening during that first part of the lifespan, both biologically and also as you know, a life course perspective and at the social roles of children, so their vulnerability and those sorts of issues. So I do have data on children. The problem is, however, when I don't discern a signal, how to interpret that. And that's why with planning this most recent project, why we wanted to target to use that incremental Denton analysis, because it allows us to get a glimpse with finer resolution of what were the experiences during childhood in people who did survive past childhood. But that introduces a whole other source of bias, because what we're looking at is survivors of childhood, which is a special group of people, because infancy and childhood can be very vulnerable times. So I have some data. It's not as good as I would like.
Okay, thank you for that. Claire.
If I could just add to make it a bit more complicated than it already is, I was wondering how beyond the biological conditions of people and the diets and the factors of, for instance, mobility of various different groups in relation to profession, and also housing conditions and household size and all these other factors that would also have impacted, for instance, the levels to which people are exposed to plague, or the possibilities that they had to try and stay away from plague outbreaks, etc. Are there ways for you to also integrate these kinds of questions into your research?
Sadly, no. I wish. I mean, this is part of the problem with these burial practices, is the individuals were so it's standard medieval Christian burials. So they did not have burial goods. They didn't have any objects buried with them. They were wrapped in a shroud. There's no there are no plaques, no gravestones, so there's no way to identify individuals. Assumptions are made about catchment area, but it's actually not entirely clear what the catchment area was for East Smithfield. So yeah, actually linking people to occupation, neighborhood. I would love those sorts of data, but they're not available for those individuals. So but it also means that I get to collaborate with historians like Marianne Koleski, who actually has, the resolution of variables that I will never have access to. But I think at best, what we might be able to do is look at kinship through mitochondrial and nuclear DNA. But actually look, so there's this fundamental problem that our experiences are embodied on our skeleton. But what I'm looking at are physical and biological embodiments of social, cultural factors. And so it's a lens, but it's an imperfect lens. So that's why it does require interdisciplinary work to try to make inferences that make sense given what we know from the historical context. But there are things that we just are always going to be hidden to us when we're looking at the skeletal samples.
Okay, thank you. But it still sounds, what you said about how you can try and engage and at least make, the data that you do have in relation to the historical sources to be able to say, more. Yeah,
and that's why I'm so excited with the paper that Jana directed me to. I mean, this is something I'd never come across this before. So now that gives me something else to think about. If once I am able to amass more data for non-adults, how might labor practices have been affecting those patterns? Or is that putting that particular age group at greater risk of exposure to certain things? So
Let's go to Nick.
Hi, thanks. This would be a question possibly for you, Taylor, or for Rosa, or for Guy. And it's really where you're talking about canals and sewers and all the rest. And I was curious about who pays for infrastructure. Thinking again to a later period, I don't know if it's the case in the medieval period as well, but in the later period, often they end up being paid, say civic goods end up being paid for by particular consumption taxes. And so if you follow the money in that way, that you get a sense of who's actually being stuck with the bill for particular things, because consumption taxes will fall very unevenly on different parts of the population. Do you, in your sources, or maybe Rosa in yours, or Guy, are you able to track who is paying for the sewers, or who is paying for the canals, or who is paying for particular kinds of health-related infrastructure?
Yes, I think depends on which period of time we are speaking about, which kind of infrastructure. But we know that certainly there are individuals that were asked to pay for some sort of infrastructures. As well, we have the commune who paid for this kind of infrastructure. So yes, fiscal resources, incomes were especially for wars. We know this, but sometimes the incomes from fiscal taxes were used for infrastructures like that, like those. So depends. Is not just one kind of payer.
So,
yeah, and Guy, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because
okay, go ahead.
At least sometimes later on, they often make, like in the 15th and 16th century, they might make a connection between a particular tax and a particular good or a particular service. And so maybe in the 13th century, that connection is not being made. But I was just curious about that.
No, no, for the 13th century, I can't see this in the fiscal declarations, certainly. But we know that some people, some group of artisans who used some canal, for example, they were asked to pay for repair, to repair the canal or to build the canal. So there was quite private support in the community popolo.
I just want to say, Nick, I sort of resent the fact that you're trying to, reject this model that, the 1% is creating jobs for all these people. You realize that. So if they end up paying for the infrastructure, I really don't, I'm not sure what is it that they teach you up there, across the border about, how money works. Very, very strange ideas that you bring to the table. But I think I have the same experience in the archives as Rosa does with, there's at least a hybrid model where the infrastructure is being financed by public money, as it were, and or those who are immediately using the infrastructure or they're going to be impacted by it. And it actually goes to the heart of something I talk about in the book, and we're all interested actually in different ways in the project about what is the physical as opposed to what is the spatial and what is the fiscal boundary between private and public spheres. Because it's very clear, for example, that a government, whether it's Bologna or elsewhere, can tell you exactly how to fit your latrine or how to fit drains in your own private accommodation because it impacts the sendscape, which is not contained by the walls of your house, which is a very interesting, right? It's a divide that collapses in the face of a Galenic concept that militates against an otherwise very clear divide between private and public. but it's also in a way, it's in their interest. And I think this is something that also Italy and the Low Countries and other areas share, which is that you're always responsible for what's happening halfway through the street in front of your domicile. And in many cases, those domiciles, back to an earlier question someone raised, that domicile is also your atelier, right? So it's also going to be your place of business. Very few people lived and worked in different at the artisanal level, unless it's a bigger factory. So it stood to reason that the division of labor and also paying for it, because we see this from the fungo. A lot of the payments and the fines, it's for people who are neglecting their own backyards. It's a form of like reverse NIMBYism, right? They're the ones who are neglecting it, or if they're up the street, or then they're ruining for their neighbors, and then their neighbors come to complain. But there's a very large assumption that they're going to be the ones paying for it. Who pays what the tax money pays for in the case of Bologna at a routine level is the fungo. Right, so it's the monitoring and the general maintenance of the infrastructure when they can't find someone who's actually responsible for damage or neglect. But otherwise, if it's a street that's functional, you know who is going to be held responsible for it.
Yeah. And in the statutes, they will also specify, for things like paving or for a drain, that everybody living along the street has to contribute. And I mean, how exactly that got carried out, and if that got carried out, we would have to go check the fiscal sources. But they do often specify that people living within these confines have to contribute. So on that note, I think we've essentially reached our time. So thank you everybody for coming. Yeah, Guy probably wants to go to sleep. Yeah, so thank you to all of our participants and our discussant. Thank you everybody for coming, and
thank you for Taylor for organizing.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you for having us, and thank you for doing this so well.
Oh, well, I'm so glad, and this was wonderful, and I hope I know it gave me a bunch of ideas. I'm sure it did for everybody as well. And the website is live, so you can go check it out. And if anybody, we welcome any feedback, comments, contributions, anything. So yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.
Spread the word. And thank you very much for everyone for coming, and hopefully see you soon in Ghent for yet another production of great ingenuity. Okay.
All right.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick.
Bye.
Thank you.